Listen to me, there's a tale I would tell you of love and of battle, of sorrow and grief, the deeds of a king and the valor of comrades, the favor of gods and the fate of a thief. Proud were her guardsmen like rochwood in winter, boot trampled earth spoke of how well they fought. As each man lay lifeless, I knelt and I swore that the sacrifice given would not be for naught. I heed not the warnings of rain and of thunder. I heed not the cries of my own panicked mare. I heed not the tides that would tear us asunder. For her, I dare. Sunk in a tree was a silver-chased dagger, carved in the fashion of our barbarity. Hung from its blade was the pirate's demand for a ransom in gold that Our Lady go free. I am the blade, but by her I am tempered. Strong in her love I've a deed to perform. Set well our sails in the wake of the pirates. They are the shadow by. I will not despair. I heed not the tides that would tear us asunder. For her, I dare. We put to the ocean in the swiftest of vessels, to sail on the Mediterranean Sea, to light our ships for the winds of the gale and the torrents of rain lashing mercilessly. Mercy, I cried to the god of the ocean, and spoke of the beauty my lady possessed. Like the god's own graceful daughter seemed she, and I offered my faith for his aid in my quest. Thunderclouds parted, the sun lit the heavens, the sea turned to glass as we sighted our prey. With the winds now behind us, we measured the distance. Soon their ships lay but a few leagues away. Now to your weapons, my men and companions, now for this
Hello, Your Grace. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. I'm so sorry I cut you off. It is wonderful having you here. I'm very excited to see what you're bringing to our group. Would you like to give us a little introduction?
Sure. So for people who are watching that don't know me, my name's Marc de Arundel. I'm a knight and a duke out of the West Kingdom. I've been doing SCA for about 20 years, and I was knighted 12 years ago. I just got a Facebook notification. That's my anniversary coming up, so that's exciting. I won 2 Western crowns with a 2-handed sword in an open list, so I had to fight against pole weapons and sword and shield and all that kind of stuff. And then I also won my most recent crown fighting sword and buckler, again in an open list. So I had to fight sword and shield and pole weapons and everything else. It was very scary. Before I got into SCA combat, I started traditional martial arts when I was 7. So I did traditional Taekwondo for a little over 20 years, earned a 3rd degree black belt in that, transitioned to Western boxing in the middle of that. And so did some boxing. And then in college, I was doing classical fencing. And one of my teachers pulled out this helmet and I was like, holy cow, I have to do that. And so I got into armored combat. I actually started with blunt steel fighting first. So we were doing, everybody had a little 2-handed sword and we were doing blunt steel fighting. And when that group closed down, one of my friends said, well, there's this other group, it's a little different. Let's go give that a shot. And so I showed up to my first SCA practice and got demolished. I got my butt absolutely kicked because I was still using a 2-handed sword and everybody else was using shields and I didn't really know how to deal with those. And I was told that I would never be very good or win any tournaments or get knighted if I didn't pick up sword and shield. But I'm kind of a grumpy bastard, so I stuck with it and took many kickings of my ass, but eventually started figuring out some ways to transition what I knew in a way that worked in our particular combat sport. And so I am going to try to share a lot of the kind of training techniques and really the training mentality that I got from all those different combat sports coming into SEA combat and doing some things that are kind of unusual. So I do own a shield. I fight with it very occasionally, but it's not the thing that brings me joy. I much prefer the longsword or the sword and buckler. So those are mostly going to be the tools I'm using today. Great. So if we get into the mentality piece of it, Pell work can be very useful or completely useless and just embed bad habits. So we have to be very intentional about how we approach Pell work and what we're trying to get out of it. And so I jotted down some notes and I shared those a little earlier. They're on the group's page if you're interested. So the first thing I want to talk about is that practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. This is a saying I stole from one of my old coaches. So whatever you do 100 or 1,000 times on the Pell is what you're going to do in a fight when you don't have time to think. So if you embed sloppy habits or things that don't make a lot of sense, like throwing a shot into the middle of where your opponent's shield would be, that is what you're going to do in a fight. So we want to be very thoughtful about how we approach mechanics and movement and be very intentional about what we practice on the Pell, because you essentially want to practice how you want to fight. So we want to be very important about that. And I think a lot of people probably have heard there's this theory that it takes 10,000 hours to achieve mastery. And you hear this a lot, particularly in music, right? People say it takes 10,000 hours of practice to be a master, but they talk about that in golf and tennis and in martial arts. But it has to be intentional practice. So I don't know if it's popular in the whole world, but in the West Kingdom, we have a very common training modality called the century drill, where you throw 100 shots per day for 100 days. And if you miss a day, you have to start over. And that can be great if you're throwing 100 shots, you're being very intentional. But if you just plant yourself and throw 100 snaps and you're not at the basic level where you just have to learn simple body mechanics, it's not going to do much to make you a better fighter. Now, doing Pell work every day and throwing a combination of different shots and trying to flow with it, that's incredibly beneficial. So just remember that we need purposeful practice. And when we all get to go back to fighter practice, that does extend to fighter practice. If I just go to fighter practice and I just want to kill more people than kill me and go home and, hey, I killed, Duke Uther 10 times and he only killed me 8. And I don't know why those things happened or what I'm getting out of it. I'm not getting as much out of the practice as I could be. So we want to be intentional. We call it setting victory conditions, and I have to do this a lot because often when I go to a fighter practice, there might not be a lot of fighters that could hit me a lot if I choose to just button down and not give them any opportunities. But that's a good time for me to practice. Well, I'm only going to land this offside shot based on a return, or I'm only going to do this, or I'm only going to step in this way to make it happen, or I'm only going to kill with counterattacks. So I can set victory conditions that maybe get me hit a little bit more, but I've actually set a goal that I'm working towards and my overall skill set is improving. And it's not just fighting in practice. There's times for that too. That can be fun, but it's important to be intentional. So I want to get into the kinds of Pell work that happens. So although I'm generally a longsword guy, I do fight sword and buckler, and I think most people joining us are going to be, sword and blocky thing people. So I'm going to bounce back and forth. Beyond a basic level of how to throw shots, I don't think that static Pell work is particularly useful because ideally we don't fight in a static way. So I can certainly use a Pell to work on power generation. And if you are a newer fighter, that is definitely something you should be working with. So if you line up in front of your Pell, maybe you have your set up target. And if you take kind of the classic Western high stance, so your sword is back behind your head, your shield foot is back, you're set on the Pell, and you're just practicing driving with the body, serving the soup, if that's how you learn how to do it, and just throwing a good shot. Awesome. That is a great thing to do. And if you can't do that thing, you should definitely be practicing throwing hard, right? Nice and relaxed. So you have good power generation without a lot of impact. You're hitting on edge. That's great. But not too often when we fight do we just go, okay, let's fight from here and never move. That's not really good fighting. So we do need to learn how to move when we're facing our opponent here. So power generation, basic mechanics is definitely something to work on with the Pell, but you do want to go past that once you've had those basic mechanics. Once you are comfortable throwing a flat snap, throwing an offside, throwing a wrap if that's what you do, it's time to start integrating movement. You can also use the Pell to work on precision. So I've talked about this in previous videos, and I think other teachers have as well. I have my various tape marks here, so I can practice and I'm definitely going to hit only that tape mark, or only this tape mark, or only this tape mark. And I just want to practice precision. It doesn't have to be super hard or fast, but I'm practicing being able to hit the exact rivet or the exact eye slot opening that I see on my opponent, because the better your opponents get, the smaller those gaps are. So if you can take your 1¼ inch stick and hit an 1¼ inch gap, that's much better than I need a 3-inch gap to be able to get to my opponent. So practicing precision is important. The last, and I think arguably the most important kind of Pell work is really you're just using it as a reference point for when you're practicing your motion. So if I grab my shield here, and let's say I want to practice a fairly common setup, you know, flat snap to offside, whether that's an offside body or an offside leg. I'm going to start out of range because I should not be marching into range to start my attack. So I'm going to start out of range. But if I want to practice this motion, it's helpful to have a point of reference. So from here, I can throw off, snap, come back, right? And I have something, and I can certainly practice that motion in the air. That's fine. But often people find, and I like, having a point of reference. So when I'm working on all of these various physical motions, I like having a point of reference just so I know if I'm landing my overhand thrust correctly. Because I could do this in the air. It looks pretty good. That works out. But if I'm doing this and I find I'm constantly missing, I'm not able to put the point. I'm like, oh, something is wrong with my motion. I got to fix that, turn how I'm landing it so that I'm actually hitting the thing I intend to hit. So I think that's incredibly important. So when I think about Pell work and technical training, I do not particularly think about shots. I don't really go out and train a flat snap or anything else. What I think about is I think about embedding physical motions that will come out automatically. I want to have those physical motions to come out automatically. So if I have my longsword, for example, and I know that I want to set something up, I want to include my motion in it. So I'm gonna start out of range, and it's not thrust, offside, hit, lead. What I think about is I think about gathering forward with a thrust, transitioning through an A-frame, a defensive position with an offline step, a pivot to hit, and then a lead. So for me, when I think about this is a single physical motion. It's a pattern that I have. I don't have to think about any of those pieces individually because I've drilled that mechanical pattern enough that it just happens. And the nice thing about drilling mechanical patterns is that you can start to take them apart. So let's say that cool setup I just practiced, right? Thrust, offline, hit, that. In the middle of that, I see that my opponent has done something that makes that motion completely invalid. They stepped to the side, they backed out, they turned, it's already blocked. I could finish that motion, it will gain me nothing, and it might even put me in danger because I might be in a vulnerable place. Because I'm not thinking about any of those things, boom, from here, I can revert to a different mechanical motion, which is where I pivot and come back to the other side. So I can choose, I can finish this motion, I can turn it to something else, and I can flow between those easily because I've drilled those motions so much. One of the things I actually do sometimes is I will drill parts of a motion. So there's a back edge shot that some of us use. If a shield guy gets in close on us, we'll actually step in to cover this line, and then we will throw this back edge back behind the shield. So I will actually come in and practice block, hit, and I will actually reverse it, block, hit, and I'm just practicing this part of the motion so that when I need it, my body can just do it. And I can start this and then turn it into something else because the motion of step, pivot, come back is embedded in my body. It's not something, I don't ever have to go, oh shit, I should now step over here. I can just let that part of the motion turn into the next thing. Let me take a look at my notes. Yeah. And so one of the things that's really important is that I'm going to try to be very careful not to use absolute language because there's different ways to do things. But in general, attacks should be done with the feet and the body. One of the things that I'm very big on is not leading with my face. So because either with the longsword or the sword and buckler, I do not have a large amount of passive defense, I don't really want to ever step and then throw, because the first thing my opponent sees is my face. So I don't want the first thing that my opponent can reach to be a target. What I want to do is, whether I'm right foot back, I'm right foot lead, I want to lead with my tools so that the first thing my opponent has to deal with in their range is a threat. Now you can also do that with a defense, right? I could start to come in and step up behind a ward, but I want them to deal with my tools first, not a target first. So that means that all of my, whether you want to think of them as combinations or setups or engagements, all of them start out of range. This is very important. So from here, now I actually prefer a goofy foot lead. So from here, I want to do this. I want my sword to come first. I do not want to do this, because they could possibly hit me in the face or stab me in the face while I'm coming in, because they can reach a target before they have to deal with my tools. So if I want to think of, just a snap to an offside and then back out, and back out, trying very hard not to step and throw. So when we talk about power generation, I think most people in the West learn classical Western power generation. So, sword is behind, some blocky thing is in front. And usually you hear a few different things. You talk about the serve the soup analogy, where you're driving with the core, right? I actually like to say a palm up punch, but the point is that we're driving, right? And the power comes forward. This is good, and you can hit really hard, but this does teach a very planted power generation style. What you can do, though, is you can allow, let me back up a little more, you can allow your front foot to move with that. So rather than push off the back foot, drive, and stay stable, I can let that move me forward. I'm just letting the front foot float. Everything else is the same. Still the same power generation, but now I'm letting the front foot move so that I can come in with my attack, so that I'm starting out of range. My opponent can't hurt me. And I come in, I'm still hitting plenty hard, but a threat is approaching them first. For right foot lead fighters, of which I tend to be one with the buckler, we use something called the offset hip. So to generate good power, you need to create tension in the body in some way. Classic Western high does that, right? Because I reach back and now I have that tension stretch and I can throw. Another way to do it is I put this in here, and this hip is rotated so that the hip is in front of the hand, this way. And so now I can drive across the body. So rather than pull back to create the tension with my hand here, I rotate my hip forward. And this lets me uncoil the throw. So now with this sword position, my core is still engaged. So I'm not arming stuff. That's not really going to work. But if I'm here, now my core is engaged, and I can just stand and throw, right? That's fine. But preferably, when I do that, I'm going to push off the back foot, and now my sword is going to precede me into range of the opponent. So I can't hit it. Doesn't have to be crazy far. But now my sword can precede me, which means they have to deal with the threat and not just plunk me in the face because I don't have a giant shield. That's very, very important. And I think a lot of people struggle with that because they've been taught a planted power generation style. So what I do see a lot of people do is they end up step, drive, or shuffle, drive. But you don't have to be planted to drive, and you shouldn't really fight in a planted manner. There are times that people fight an inside game, but even with that, you should still be adjusting and moving with your body and feet. Shouldn't really be arm, and it doesn't have to be this crazy hip rotational thing. It doesn't have to be that. It can be very small motions. Let's see how we do. So when we talk about embedding movement patterns, something that's incredibly important is embedding your feet, embedding your body, embedding the sword, but also embedding your defense. if you fight with a shield, you should probably do a pretty decent amount of your Pell work with your shield. Because so for example, I have my buckler. If I don't include defense in my motions, I'm absolutely going to get cracked in the head. One of the things that I talk about a lot with the sword and buckler is called the tool exchange. The idea is that essentially one tool should be covering high and low at all times, at most times. There's no absolutes. And that means if I throw a low shot, my buckler should be going up here somewhere. So one of the things that I like to do is I like that little come in here and then leave. But if you look, the embedded part of my motion is that tool exchange. I am not hitting, turning, looking to see if I have to block. That is, I'm going to get hit. It's too slow. What I want to do is have a good, real fundamental position so that my standard position catches most oh shit counters. And then I can leave with that clearing motion. And so you see, I started high and low. I threw, did the tool exchange, and then when I leave, I switch them back. And it doesn't have to be specifically that if you're not a sword and buckler fighter, but it does need to be something that includes your defense with it. Even with the one weapon, when I think about transitioning between attacks, like that little thrust to hip that I like so much, when I do this, I thrust, and I actually step through my A frame. This is a covering position to make sure that I'm not getting hit in the middle in that transition time. Then I throw, and then I leave under another cover. It's incredibly important. So when we're using our body to drive shots, we should be transitioning through defensive positions on our way to the next shot. Very important. Let's see. So I think that takes us to, oh, actually, I did have some people send me in some questions. This is a good time for it. So I was asked about equipment and training with different things. So most of the time when I do Pell work, I actually prefer to do it with a metal or a nylon trainer if I'm using my one-handed. And the reason I do that is because both because I cross-trained in HEMA, because I came from steel fighting before, but also it is important to me that I am doing things with my rattan baton that I can do with a real sword. And swords that have flats and edges move differently and impact differently than a round baton. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Even in period, there was baton training tools and baton tournaments. That's great. But if it is important to you to do things with your rattan baton that you could do with a sword, it is important to train with an edge simulator sometimes. Particularly if you are a competitive fighter and you're looking to do well in tournaments and those kinds of things, you should train with what you fight with a significant portion of the time. I would say probably 70% of the time. But it is important that you know sometimes when things are happening. So with an edge, actually I'm going to grab the blunt. With an edge simulator, if I come in and I do this, it kind of sort of landed on edge. It's more on edge and flat. I didn't do this, right? It's kind of 45-ish with my motion, but that's not going to cut anything. If I do test cutting or I hit something with a real sword and I come in 45-ish on the edge and not really on the edge, it's not going to cut. So that same motion I was doing with the sword and buckler, if I want to be here, I just need to make sure that same motion will put me edge on with the sword. And because these are so much more honest, because they have flats and edges, it will really tell you if your motion is a little off. So if I'm doing a flip shot, for example, and I come in just a little bit off, not 100% off, but a little bit, it's going to give me a lot of feedback. But if I come in edge on, I'm going to know it pretty well, right? That's flat, that sucked, that was on edge. So it really helps me fine tune the motions, and it doesn't mean that I have to change much. Land a good shot, but now I know that the things I'm throwing with a rattan baton would work with a real sword. And that's really important. And then I was also asked about doing Pell work with gauntlets. My gauntlets that I fight with are Wisby finger gauntlets. So they do have an enclosed thumb tip, but these are not grounding in the fingers. These are padded, pretty close to a period example. The big safety concession I use is that I have little finger beziques that I stick on my right, and that. So I do my Pell work in my gauntlet sometimes, but frankly, the grip change is so minimal that I really don't have to. If your gear has a significant impact on how you move, though, you probably should do some of your Pell work in your gear. I would look at fixing your gear if it has a big impact on how you move, because good armor should be comfortable and protect you, but allow you to move. A lot of gauntlets, they force a hammer grip, which does not let you do a lot of the fine motor control, because you really should be able to use like a saber or a handshake grip with a two-handed weapon or a pole arm. And if you can only close your hand down like a hammer grip, those are not great gauntlets. They might keep you safe, and safety should be the #1 concern. But weapons feel, if you're primarily a great weapon fighter, is incredibly important. If you can't do some of that fine motor control stuff, you're handicapping yourself even more than you would be in SCA heavy combat when you're using a great weapon in an open list. And it's a tough road for us. We have to be like extra perfect, or we just get smushed. The plus side is you get extra rockstar points if you do well with it. But it's a hard road for sure. If you are a newer longsword or pole weapon fighter, I do not recommend finger gauntlets. I block with my hands very rarely, and I've never been hurt in these wearing the beziques, but I don't punch block and block with my hands, and it's pretty rare that I screw up badly enough that I take a stinger in these. But one of my squires, who's also a longsword guy, I will not let him fight in these yet, because he is still a hand blocking goofball, is what we call him, and he knows it. He likes to say that he's about 2 years out from finger gauntlets. So the gear is important, and if you have gear that significantly changes how you move, my 2 suggestions are possibly modify your gear so you can move in it better, and then 2, you should do at least some Pell work in your gear. Let me see if there were other questions. All right, so I think what I want to do now is I want to go through the 1 through 6 drill with the longsword as an example of how the transitions are frankly more important than the actual shots. Beyond a basic level, pretty much everybody can throw a killing blow, flat snap, and offside. And if you have a two-handed weapon beyond a basic level, you really should be able to land a killing blow. But being able to get there in a way that keeps you alive and catches the other person off guard or hits an opening is incredibly important. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do some of that. And there are lots of videos on the 1 through 6, just as a quick refresher for how I choose to do it. For me, the numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think when Duke Jade first came up with the drill, his numbers were different, but I only heard about it secondhand, so this is how I do it. And so, again, I'm going to start out of range. This is very important. I cannot just reach out and hit this, because that means that I am safe. I can look at my opponent. They can't hit me, I can't hit them, and I can kind of figure out what's going on. And then I'm going to try very hard to come in with an attack. So again, I'm not going to step and then throw. I'm going to try very hard to throw and step. Boom. And ideally, my foot and my cut lands at about the same time. So for 1, if I'm going to go to number 2, how do I get there? I'm not going to retract and just do this. I'm going to use my feet. So the most common way is I'm going to turn through my A-frame. So see how I turn my hips and I stepped. And I have this kind of slanted shot. So this will protect me against flat snaps or slots. Okay. And it primes me for a good counterattack. I can now just push the pommel and turn my hips and pivot and land a very hard shot right on the target. Boom, number 2. So how do I go from number 2 back to number 1? I could do that A-frame thing again and do that whole thing, but I often like to take a step and hit with the back edge. So now I'm here. And if you see, I'm on this side of the sword. It actually also keeps me safe, because my 1 sword has to do both jobs now. So I don't want to do this, where if they're a general righty and I just kind of reach over, they're going to clunk me in the head. I want to ideally be covered. So you'll see me step or lean so that my head is on one side of my blade, because my blade has to do double duty. So from here, again, I could retract and hit, but that's a lot of dead space, or I'm probably going to get cracked in the head. So from here, I might roll and step out. Now I'm going to use the range and see how I hit, and I'm now completely out of range. I use my step to power my shot and get me out of danger. That's very important. So I've done the 3, so now I have to come back to number 1. I could do the back edge again. I could do the A-frame. I could actually do a rising cut. Boom. Back to number 1 and see my head is still on one side. 4, transition through maybe a hanging guard now. See how I've taken my step? It's that same, this is, for me, this is one motion. I step and cover, and I'm gonna pivot and throw. Boom. And now my head's back on this side. I can step this way, roll, here, flat, and see how I've come back out of range. So as I'm stepping, I'm throwing, then when I settle, I'm out of range. This is very important because if I'm fighting another longsword guy, I want to be out of their range. And certainly if I'm fighting another sword and shield guy and they block that, I do not want to get cracked in the head. Okay. Then back to 5, over to 6. And so there's lots of different ways to transition. So I think if we're looking at the most common ways, step and hit, step through this defense, the A-frame, hit anything over here. I can step through this A-frame, right? So I have, if I'm looking at a sword, the angle is important. I don't do this, because then I can get slotted on top of the head. But if I turn, the diagonal will cover slots and it will cover the horizontal shot. So we call this the A-frame, the 2 legs of the capital A. 80% of your upper body defense should be this anyway with a longsword. So we're just practicing moving through this defensive position as a load to every attack. So boom, boom. So I can do hanging guard. So from 1, you can roll through here, go here, go through here, go here. The nice thing about hanging guards is certainly, I think it's pretty easy to see. It gives you a huge windup for a big overhead shot. And if you get a little bit more competent with it from here, people worry about this, but you can actually throw on the same side. Still hit super hard, but people don't expect it. Same thing with sword and blocky thing. So again, I'm out of range, whether I've got a foot back or I'm moving foot. Boom. And see, my head is still on one side. So when I throw, because I don't have much passive defense, when I throw, my hand is across. It's not this, because I'm not blocking my head. Even if I do this, that's not a lot of real estate. So if I can, I'm going to cross the line so that my sword attack defends me and hopefully hits the bad guy in the head. Now again, I can A-frame. It's the exact same thing, and now I just have the sword and buckler, and I can throw. And step under the hanging guard. Did a little switch because my tools went high and low, so I got to switch those. Okay, come up here, so this kind of thing. And again, I'm back out of range. See, every time I settle, I'm just a little bit out of range. I don't really ever come in and throw some stuff and then stay there. Because if the other person isn't dead, I would like them to just not even be able to swing at me. I would like them to feel like swinging at me is a waste of time because I've come in and done my thing, and then I've left, and hopefully they're dead. But if they're not, I want them to be like, ah, shit, I can't even hit them if I want to. It's very important. So when I work with people, one of the things I say all the time is that engagements start and end out of range and in guard. And I'm guilty of this too, but we shouldn't do stuff like this. That looked pretty good. Okay, no. Ideally, we're out of range, we throw, boom, under cover, and then we're back in our guard. That is how we should be fighting, right? We start out of range and guard, we end out of range and guard. So we should practice that way because again, what you practice becomes permanent. So if what you want is practice makes perfect, then you should practice those good habits. How we doing? Any questions on the live stream? You are mute.
I was muted. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, we had a question as to the height of your Pell.
I mean, I think that thing's like 8 feet tall. I inherited it. But what I do is I sit up to it and I just go, that's about temple, that's about sternum, that's a little bit above my knee. And I have the red, don't hit the knee danger target. What was I gonna say? I actually don't mind it being a little taller than me because at 5'11" and 180 pounds, I am SEA size puny. So definitely most of the gods that I grew up fighting were much bigger than me. You know, so I tended to train for people a little tiny bit bigger for me. And I also tend to fight in a crouch stance. I would say, you know, 6 foot is a great Pell. That's a pretty average sized person. If you are significantly shorter than average, there's not really much point in drilling a bunch of perfectly aimed temple shots on yourself if everybody's a foot taller than you. So I would say set up a Pell that reflects the average combatant, and then just go from there. That's how I would do it. Did that make sense? Cool. All right. So I'm going to go through the two flow. So if I'm doing my offsides here and I want to step in or shuffle, I'm going to throw my two, step under for the hanger, throw the one, step in A-frame, throw the two, and again, every time I settle, I am out of range, just a little bit. It doesn't have to be crazy big leaps. The difference is here I can hit, and here I can't, which means they can't hit me either. So then my two, step 3, 4, 5, 2, 6. And I can come back into 3. You might notice that I am not throwing any wraps, and that is because I don't. And that's a conscious choice. I can throw them, and sometimes when I'm being a shit, I throw them at practice. But the reason is that with medieval arming swords, because you would be using a cruciform hilt, wraps endanger the hand quite a bit, and they take longer compared to a snap or an offside. And the bulk of the infighting that SCA Sword and Shield does is sophisticated and clever and very effective, but it's not particularly period, because in period we would be grappling. So some of the inside techniques that are effective in SCA combat are not really reflective of period sword arts, and so I choose not to use them because that's my primary focus in SCA combat, is doing things with a baton that I can do with would do with a steel sword. So you can definitely do your wraps, but even with those, make sure that you are including that kind of stuff. So if you want to throw an offside to step in for a wrap, that's awesome, great, no problem. Still switch your tools, and then still move through a defense when you're leaving. So all of those same rules apply. And I think wraps are certainly easier to use and pull off if you're using a bigger shield that gives you more passive defense, just because wraps take more time compared to just a snap. Let me see. More questions?
We do have a few more questions. One in particular, do you have ideas for teaching people to break the bad habit of throwing directly into the shield?
Yes. So Pell work primarily should be done slow and smooth, because if you have embedded muscle memory, the way to break that is essentially you're going to groove a new pattern. And the way you need to do that is have conscious control over it the whole time. So if I have developed a pattern, and Lord knows I came into SCA combat with patterns that were bad for SCA combat, because I'd done other sword arts first, you need to go slow. So if I know, for example, every time I throw my snap or my onside equivalent, I'm throwing low. If I just go fast, I'm like, oh, I gotta get up. And I don't have a lot of control, I'm just gonna throw the same thing. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do it very slowly. I'm gonna use all my motion. I'm gonna set up and I'm gonna come in. I'm gonna hit, oh, see, I missed. All right, well, I didn't get that right. So I gotta come in, there we go. And I'm gonna come back. So I'm out of range. I'm practicing the whole motion very slowly over and over until I know exactly what it feels like to land where I want it to land. Okay, because you can't really see yourself. So you have to learn from the inside what it feels like to do it correctly. You have to be able to picture yourself doing it correctly. You got to know what it's going to feel like. You have to replicate that feeling on the Pell 100 times, 1,000 times, however long it takes you. And then you have to go out and do it in a fight. And so the benefit of drilling something that doesn't hit your back is that you can practice it over and over and over again until you get it right. But if you don't practice it perfect, you will practice a permanent problem. So, and unlearning things is harder. So if you had been a blank slate and you could have done it 100 reps and done it perfectly, now you're gonna have to do it 200 reps because you have to unlearn and then relearn, and that sucks, that's hard. And I had a lot of things that I started with that got me killed a lot. When I started in the SCA, because of the sword group I belonged to, I actually learned to block like this. So we went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I didn't know it at the time, but that was actually based on a European theatrical fighting system called the fives, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So when I was fighting other people that did the exact same thing I did pretty well. But when I came and started fighting SCA fighters who tended to be faster and stronger, and because they were using rattan, they could hit a lot harder than we were, I got demolished. And one of the things that I would do is I would do this, and they would either wrap around it or they would just slap me on top of the head. So I had to learn that I needed to do those angled parries to actually cover and I had to do it more in front of me, because this is just asking to get wrapped in the head, right? So I need that defense out, and I need those angles. And it took me a long time to unlearn, oh shit, and learn how to block correctly. And so one of the things I tell my students is that if they could learn to fight the way I do, but without the bad habits I had in, they're going to be so much better than me, because it took me such a long time, and I still have bad habits from those early things. Did you have another question, or I can go on to my next? Okay.
I do. We have a question regarding sword and buckler. Do you block more with the face or the edge?
I block more with the sword. So, couple things. Sword and buckler, as practicing period, particularly my focus is on Master Lignitzer, who is a 15th century German master. You need to think of this as a paired weapon system. And the sword is actually your primary defensive tool. So you should not be trying to do this and punch out and block. That doesn't work very well. It's pretty easy to fake. And if you guess wrong with a 12-inch pie plate, you're going to get hit in the ribs, and that sucks. So if you look at, for example, the first play in Lignitzer's Sword and Buckler, what he tells you to do is actually bring your sword to your buckler hand, and you bind with the sword. So essentially the sword blocks, and then once you have contact, you can switch and press. But you really should be thinking of these as a paired system, not 1 and 2. That said, when I block with the buckler, generally it is the face, because if I block with the edges, particularly the plastic ones, it'll skip off. And so I would say that most of the time, if I catch a block with the buckler, it is generally on the face. Also, because I have pretty standard size wrists, things that catch here might roll or tweak my wrist. And if it catches directly onto the face, my skeleton is supporting that rather than my wrist joint. And so I get less wear and tear on my joints if I block on the face. I also try to make it a point that I turn my core so that my whole structure is supporting both of my tools if I'm blocking, rather than pushing across, where you see how my structure isn't really defending that. So some big brute with a two-handed sword, or even somebody like an Uther or Duke Brennan from the East, bigger guys than me, if they come in and throw a nice hard shot and I do this with no structure supporting it, they're going to blow through and hit me anyway. So I need to make sure that my skeleton and not my muscles are doing the work. So that's how I approach defense with the sword and buckler. Cool. All right. So I had a couple different people ask me, they were concerned that I said that slow work was more important and more beneficial than fast work. I think I had at least 3 different people ask me why I said that. So there's a couple things. So my Pells are not padded. They're essentially just a post with a nice sleeve on them. So I'm going to wreck my swords, and I'm going to wreck my joints if I hit them super hard and fast all the time. The other thing is that when I'm practicing on the Pell, I'm trying to practice precision of motion and flow. And practicing slow means that my muscles and my intention are engaged the entire time. So I could definitely come out and just throw some stuff. That was pretty hard, and it, even landed on edge. But if I want to embed a perfect motion, I want to make sure that my muscles are engaged the whole time. I can feel the weight of the sword. I know exactly the way my body is connected, how my hips are turning to make everything work. So you don't have to go crazy slow all the time. I'm not trying to say that everything should be at this speed. But what I am saying is that keeping everything engaged, so you're working on your flow and your precision, is more important than just blasting the Pell 100 times. Especially if you are trying to embed new motions or new patterns, you want to make sure that you are under conscious control the whole time, so that you know exactly what you're doing. Because as soon as you've let momentum take over, you're not as much in control of the thing. And in a fight, that's fine. Like, you throw the fast shot and that's great. But when you're trying to embed a new pattern, you really want your attention and your muscles to be engaged the whole time. And so I would say if you're a newer fighter and you're worried about am I hitting hard enough? Definitely start slow, do most of it slow. Be here, and if you're learning a new mechanic, this is the time to be static because you're learning a new mechanic. And you can just say, all right, I'm throwing. Does it look like my edge is hitting? Cool. Am I crossing the plane with my sword? Cool. Am I driving with the body? Great. Start practicing that. Maybe ramp it up a little bit. And then take a time to like, all right, I feel like I have the motions. I feel like I'm doing consistently all the time. Now I'm going to ramp up the power a little bit and just make sure. And if you do something, you're like, wow, that really hurt my wrist. Then something's wrong. We got to go back and figure out what the problem was. So you go back and go, okay, am I throwing and am I turning my wrist at the last moment, or am I doing this? But to figure that out, you again have to go back to going slow. So there are times to be static on a Pell, if you're learning a new mechanic. There are times to hit it fast. But in terms of learning a new pattern or embedding a new pattern, I think maybe I should say mid-speed. Mid-speed might be a better way to do it. Because what I would say my average pace of Pell work probably looks something like this. If I'm doing my 1 through 6 and I'm just out on a normal day, stuff like that. And that is not fast for me, but it is not, through Jello slow either. But when I am learning a new mechanic, I do slow it way down to try to figure out. Like I've just been doing something where there's a shot I like where I will throw and I will pull it into a thrust. So I will, and throw it short, right? So I'll throw it. And my students have started picking that up and they're not letting me stab them in the face with it anymore. So, but they're all cross-paired. I'm like, all right, what do I need to do to take advantage of that new tell? Well, now I can and turn it into the next thing. So I can throw it, thrust, turn it into a slot. And so I'm actually throwing down the Pell on purpose because I want to practice the slot shot. But when I first learned it, I practiced the motion like that. So I could see, what do I need to do? How does it feel to throw that correctly with my core, where I'm starting out of range, throwing it? How do my feet need to go? Because if I do this in range, again, we crack on the head. So how do I present a threat and that secondary feint in a way that keeps me back? Because practicing a motion that's going to get me clubbed in the head at speed with an opponent is useless. Back. And then eventually, I just practice that. And then coming back out of range. Did you have any questions or thoughts on the slow versus fast thing? Because like I said, a few different people messaged me about it.
No, I don't think we have any questions on that so far. I think we're good. I know I had spoken to you about that a little bit because I was told for so long to work slowly, and that's all I did was slow, slow, slow. And I never actually attempted to take it up to full speed. And that was extremely awkward for me when it was time to do that.
Well, and one of the things that I'm kind of and I'll touch on this more when I get to treating the Pell like an opponent, but the slow practice thing assumes a certain amount of understanding and honesty in the practice. So if I'm going slow, but I have a crappy grip and noodly arms, I'm just doing this. Well, I'm definitely going slow, but this is not good Pell work. And if I try to do this at speed, I'm not going to kill anybody because I'm not going to hit them hard enough. And I have openings everywhere. And so, yes, I'm going slow, but there's no real technique there. There's no real grip. There's no real body and core. So slow practice can be absolutely detrimental if you aren't doing it correctly. It's just like slow work. I know some kingdoms don't really have a tradition of slow motion fighting like some of the Western states do. But in the West, slow work, where two guys gear up and they're essentially just fighting at a very slow pace, about this speed, is super common. People use it as a training technique. People use it as a warm-up. And it is a great tool because it gives you time to see and process what is happening. So if you know, man, when I fight, that guy, he hits me with a wrap every time I throw that low shot. In slow work, you have time to see it coming. And so it's a good diagnostic tool. It's a good training tool. But if you cheat your blocks, or you cheat your techniques, or you speed up to catch stuff, then it's kind of useless because there's no honesty in the drill. So when the slow work on the Pell is very important because of all those things that I've mentioned, those embedding those good techniques, but it's got to be about having good core engagement, good edge alignment, good joint alignment, because a lot of people hurt their wrists because they don't have their wrists aligned, and then when they really club something, it messes them up, or it messes up their shoulder. So I think if you have a teacher, it's definitely easier because they can look, you can go, yes, you're going slow, but also you're really going to jack up your elbow if you throw that like that. And that's why you have to do fast stuff sometimes. But I think for me, slow work is more important. And generally, I would say that I pretty much never do full speed Pell work, ever. I cannot, in the last decade, remember a time that I just blasted my Pell because I thought I was training something. So I have done it when it's been a frustrating day. It's at work. I will cop to that. Let me see. Oh, somebody asked me about left-handed practice. Do I switch to fight lefties with the left hand? No, I don't. Even with the two-handed sword, I should be able to throw everything to both sides evenly with the lead hand. I will do it sometimes as a training, or again, just to be a shit in practice. That's very common for me, being a shit. But no, I don't switch to left hand to fight lefties in particular. Somebody asked me about throwing the undercuts in heavy combat. So in German longsword, the primary cuts are Oberhaus, overcuts, and Unterhaus, rising cuts, undercuts. And they ask how often do I throw those in heavy? I throw them, but I would say probably 70% of the attacks are either the downward or the flat cuts, the horizontals. Usually if I'm throwing an upward cut, it's usually coming up into the grill. I like those a lot. Or if I have set something up really well and I get to hit somebody with my longsword in the armpit, that's very exciting, and that is definitely a rising cut. But I would say 70% of the time it's downward or horizontal cuts. And then somebody asked about period techniques in SCA heavy. They work for the most part. You have to understand the differences in our combat sport. So rattan batons, they bounce, they don't bind particularly well. And we hit people harder than you would need to in unarmored fighting. Because what we do is we essentially use unarmored techniques, cuts and thrusts, on armored people for safety. So if I really wanted to kill somebody in a suit of armor, or even male hauberk in an iron helmet, I would not hit them with the edge of my sword. I would throw them down and try to stab them in the eye. We don't do that, and I really like that because there's some huge, strong monsters in the SCA, and I'm not a fan of getting thrown down and stabbed in the eyeball. So we hit a little harder than we would if we were doing unarmored techniques. The rattan bounces a little bit, and we have invulnerable hands. Even the gauntlets, when I'm using a two-handed sword, those don't count. They annoy me. I feel like I personally failed, but I don't have to drop the armor or count myself dead if I get hit in the hand. So all of those things change the combat a bit, but the standard, the most classical technique in all of German longsword is the Zorn Ort, where if somebody swings at you, you countercut and stab them in the face. That's period sword technique. Absolutely works, no problem. So as long as you understand the differences in timing and range in SCA heavy, and you understand how the dynamics work, it all works fine. I actually find a lot of the period techniques easier to work in SCA heavy compared to SCA rapier or cut and thrust, because I don't have to worry about hurting people because I hit them too hard. So I actually find that pretty well. All right. So somebody asked about longsword versus sword and shield. So I think I've shown enough of the 1 through 6 drill because people have seen it before, and I talked a little bit about it. But I was going to show some of what I call my bread and butter setups. And this actually fits nicely into, been going for almost an hour already. This fits pretty nicely into kind of the other piece I wanted to talk about, which was treating your Pell like an opponent. Clearly the Pell doesn't move, and there are different things that people can do. They can put out a little leg extension, and they can hang a shield on it or stick a helmet on it. Those are all cool and useful, especially if you're trying to target a particular angle. But the biggest thing I find for treating a Pell like an opponent is really just a mental thing. So I pretend that my Pell is going to react. It's going to move forward. It's going to block things. And so I use those reactions to set up patterns. So if I'm looking at patterns, if I pretend this Pell is now the evil sword and shield guy. I hate him. He wants to run me down and club me like a baby seal. I don't like that. I have my long sword. So I'm going to start out of range, and I'm going to think about if this person has a sword and shield and they're going to come in, what are the likely things that are going to happen? And you can build some patterns off of that. So if a sword and shield person charges me, often what I will do is I will start with a face thrust. There's a couple of reasons for this. Most sword and shield guys are trained to worry about the face thrust the most. And if they raise, they might blind themselves. And you can actually pop their shield into their helmet and blind them. Okay, so that's great. And I will usually do this with a little gather step. So I'm way out of range, and I'm not going to just stand there and poke at them. I'm actually going to step out, because if I close the range a little tiny bit sooner than they think it's going to happen, I might get them, or I might get a bigger reaction, which is really important. I'm happy to stab them in the face. I'm just as happy to get a big oh shit reaction, because if I get them going up, then things become vulnerable underneath. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to thrust, step offline with that A. I'm going to hit them in the hip. So I'm actually hitting between my marks on purpose, because I want a hip shot, because that's a kill shot in the SCA. See how I'm off the line. I did not stay put. I did not do this. Staying on the line. Because if it didn't work, or even if it did, if I just stay on the line, they might hit me on the way down. So I want to be away. So I'm way out of range. I'm going to gather, hit, and leave. And I'm covering as I leave. And now I'm back out of range. I can do that to the other side, whether it's a lefty or I want to go to their sword side, because it tends to be a little bit more open. Again, I'm out of range, thrust, hit, lead. And again, I'm way out of range. I'm getting way off the line. So that's kind of what I was talking about with that body motion. That is, for me, a singular motion. I don't have to think step and thrust, stepping off the line, giving a hit. For me, that's just one thing. I don't have to think or process any of that, which means my brain is free to focus on what the bad guy is doing. So I don't have to worry about what I'm doing, because my body knows it. I can just let that happen, and I can focus on, don't let them crack me in the head with something silly while I'm doing this cool thing. That's really important. And so I can think about their reaction. So, okay, cool, my opponent raised their shield. Step, hit, and leave, just in case they throw. So that's one of the first things that I do. If they're really aggressive, awesome, you can just hit them right in the butt as they run by. That's kind of fun. They get a little annoyed, but you feel pretty cool. The next one I talked about a little bit. If they run in very aggressively, especially if they're leading with a wrap or a snap, I will again step in, because if you collapse that range faster than they're expecting, often it throws them off. So if they come in, I will step in. I don't need them to throw, but I'm moving through this defensive position in case they throw. And then what I actually do is I pivot and I throw a back edge shot to the back of their head. If they're pressing forward with their tools, often this area becomes open. So this is probably as close to a wrap as I'm going to throw at the back edge of my two-handed sword. Because I'll step in, hit, and then I keep moving out because I want to get away from their threat. So I'm thinking about an opponent. I might scooch up a little bit, like, all right, if they come in, how's that going to look? Where's their line going to be? I'm going to step, hit, and leave. And I just want to make sure that I'm covered and I'm off the line. This is another thing that you can hit them in the back of the head. I practice this to both sides. So if I go the other way, I just step through this defense and hit here with the lead edge. And then again, I'm off the line. So everything starts out of range, hits, ends out of range under a cover. And I think about how the opponent might be attacking. If they're a two-handed sword guy, and often you see people with the central guard, you can usually make somebody defend to one side or the other based on where you attack them. So a thrust is nice because a thrust is a fairly non-committed shot. I don't give much away to land a thrust that would be a telling blow, but I can stay here. So if I have a central guard and you thrust to this side, I'm almost definitely going to do this, which means you have decided where I'm putting my sword and you know where I will be open. So if I'm facing this guy, what I will do is I actually won't thrust the exact center line. I will thrust the side of the center line I want them to hit. So I will thrust just to the side of the center line on purpose. And again, if I thrust them, awesome, fight's over, that's great. But if they do catch that, I will throw now to the side that they just left. So they parry to their left, I'm gonna hit him to the right. See, I step off the line. Again, this is all one motion for me. And then I will transition through the hanging guard, through the head and leave. So that's a pretty standard setup for me. Is I'll come in and I will practice out of range, being here. I'm trying to scare my Pell. Very important. You know, don't just be like, You want them to be guessing. You want them to have, your opponent's going to defend. You want it to be an oh shit defense. You want them to be reactive. So I'm going to come in here, boom, pop, up, leave, and then back out. And then I can do it again to the other side. goes to that one. Boom, pop up, leave, back out. So again, I'm picturing my Pell as a person, what their most likely reaction to my offense is going to be, where they will put that, where that will put them, and where they will likely be open. Because humans are humans. No matter what tools they have, if they defend themselves, something else will be open. None of us can block everything. So my preferred engagement stance with sword and buckler is this, right? I like having that offset hip, so my shoulders here, my hips rotated. This is central here. So this lets me have a nice snap, nice leg shot, nice overhand thrust. Takes a little bit of a load, but I can throw an offside. And this side of my head is covered. My center line is pretty covered. Most obvious opening is the onside head. So in a way, my defense is kind of inviting you to hit only one area, which is the fastest, easiest place for me to block. But if I defend, whether it's a cross block or a hanging block, I'm leaving that other opening. Something's gonna become open. That's how it works. So if you throw and you get me to block, you know where I'm gonna be open. It almost doesn't matter which defense I choose. I'm gonna be open. So if you use that kind of thinking, if you think the first attack kills them, great. But if it doesn't, where will they be open? Where are they telling me that I should kill them? And so that's how a lot of kind of the training that I do is. So let's see, I talked about the thrust, I talked about the offside. What else do I like to do? I have my version of a rising snap. So with the two-handed sword, again, I will do a little thrust. Again, I'm out of range, using my feet, points coming in. And what I do is I'll come and I will step again off the line, and I don't throw with the arms, I throw with the body. It gives me a little crunch. So I'm kind of pulling everything in, and then I get to corkscrew and push. So then I leave. Leaving is a big thing with the longsword against sword and shield guys. So even a longsword though, because even if they're dead or they didn't like the shot or they caught the block, you need to watch out for that return shot. So again, I'm out of range, I throw, crunch with the body, hit, leave. So that's kind of the longsword version of a rising snap. Kind of do a rising snap with the sword and buckler, but that's kind of how I do it. Let's see, what else do I like? There's a cool hanging guard fake. So I'll do it to the camera first. So often if people are here, we look for this, right? This is the kind of standard, the Musashi, right? The big samurai cut, which is awesome. One of the things that I like to do though, and this is one of those embedded patterns, is I will step, pivot through, and hit back to the other side. So it's a fake. So I'll come in here and I'll be, boom. So it starts on this side, hanging guard. That's what everybody's looking for. You just come in and you go, okay, they're likely to block that. Everybody's looking for the big overhand shot. And then back out. But it's important even with this, don't just do this, because it might clunk me in the head. So even with this, I step, wave through the A-frame and then hit. So that's good for sword and shield guys or longsword guys, depending on how big their body motion is. If somebody tends to be, I don't know what you guys call it. Do you guys call it, what do you guys call this guard in like big shield, kind of the war guard? All right. Often big shield guys in our half of the world, particularly center grip, you'll see, I'll try to approximate it with my buckler. You'll see this. They have a giant shield. You can't see anything, and they're looking at you over the top, and then they do this. When people have that, and I have my longsword, I pretty much ignore the shield. I just pretend it isn't there. What I say is I have to defeat their sword. So what I want them to do is I want them to push their sword up or forward, and I want to hit that slot that happens under there. So with the longsword or the sword and buckler, what I will do is, again, from out of range, is I will push, and this is not quite a thrust. It's actually kind of a forward snap cut towards the head. I'm trying to get them to react by pushing the sword up. I just did a little bit again. Here, and then what I do is I take this pommel hand and I roll it back, and I hit that little angle. So it starts out of range, and my hand isn't coming around. That's too slow. So I just need them to pop their sword out a little bit. So even though I'm doing this on a Pell with nothing, this whole setup completely relies on my opponent reacting. If they don't react, then the shot doesn't work. So if I start to do that and they don't react, I'm like, I have to go to something else. So I'm pretending that my evil sword and shield guy has his big shield and his little cross thing, and he's reacting. Then you can throw it to the side. You can even do it as a fake. So you can throw, start here, step back. And then once you feel comfortable with that, get back into the habit of leading. I think I want to talk. I'm gonna deviate a little bit if that's okay. One thing that gets talked about a lot about out here is the float points of swords. Have you ever heard that term before? Okay, so I'm gonna do this with just the sword. I'm gonna exaggerate a little bit. So with swords, there are certain points in sword motions where the sword kind of feels floaty and weightless, and it's easy to change the direction. So I think the easiest way to find this is if I've thrown kind of a low offside, right? Boom. If I pop up and start to throw kind of the standard flip shot, there's a point right about there-ish where it feels kind of weightless, and it's very easy to snap it back and change the direction again. There's always, so if you throw low, you come up here, there's a point, you're not muscling it, but there's a point where it feels weightless. You can kind of find it. This is the time to actually, let me do this with something you can see my hand. You can actually practice, don't fight like this. This is a drill on the Pell. But what I can do is I can come up here and I can kind of, when I raise it, have a loose grip and feel that spot where the sword kind of wants to like float out of my hand in the motion. Because if I'm doing this and the sword still has inertia coming this one, I want to yank it back. That's really hard and slow. But there's a point where the sword feels weightless and a little hand and turn. See, that one was a little flat. You can see it on the sword. So boom, right? So there's a point where the sword feels kind of weightless and floating, and it's easy to change direction. Same thing, boom, weightless and floaty, and I just turn it. There's this kind of point where I'm turned, and this lets me even hit back and hit. And with the longsword, it's kind of the same thing. So if I want to reverse certain motions, let's see that little undercut, that little pop. Hit. If I want to turn it to the other side, I don't want to get over here and then have to wrestle the sword. There's a point where it feels kind of weightless. And I can just hit it right out there. I just have to push the handle over. The sword just kind of does it because there's these kind of points. So I would practice. Duke Fabian actually has a cool drill. He would take a little piece of rope and put a tennis ball on it, kind of looks like a dog toy. And he would have people spin it with their body. And you could find that place where it's easy to change direction, or if you try to do it, the rope, goes slack and the tennis ball hits stuff, it just doesn't work. The cheap alternative is using a belt, with a heavy belt buckle. Don't whack yourself in the face with a belt buckle. I've done that. Be nice, be careful. But it's cool because you can start to move this thing and you find these points in these arcs where it's easy to change the direction. And you can do that with swords, which is pretty cool. All right. Let me see, picture how so when you're doing some of these, I had somebody specifically ask about not understanding how, do we have questions or are we good? Okay. Somebody sent me a question about how do you understand where people are going to go, and then how do you practice that on the Pell? So people's body will tell you a lot. So depending on the stance, So depending on the stance, you can kind of tell what kind of emotion somebody's primed to do. If somebody is way back, their weight is way back, you see them do this, they probably are not in a good position to charge you instantly without a big weight shift. But if somebody is doing this, they probably are in a position to charge. If their hips are way back, they're probably going to do more of a shuffle step, or if their hips are more forward, they're much more likely to do that passing step. So if you look at the orientation of their core, their hips and their shoulders, you look at where their weight is shifted, you can get a lot of information about where they're most likely to go. You can do this in a more active way too. Sometimes those little thrusts or those little offside pops, you will see people react. If they are newer fighters, it will be big reactions. People will do this if they're inclined to be a defensive fighter, or they'll do this if they're inclined to be like, they're just looking for that trigger to jump your shit, right? They're definitely going to look at that. The more advanced fighters, those toes are still there, but they're much smaller. So somebody that's looking to be more defensive, and if they're a higher end fighter, it might be as little as this. It might be all it takes, right? They're more likely to plant and hunker, just little tiny, or it might just be this. That is somebody that's looking to jump your ship, just a little tiny weight shift. But if you start paying attention to it now and you start being able to pick up on it with the younger fighters who tend to have bigger tails, it'll start to become more apparent with the more advanced fighters. Don't get frustrated if they can see your tails better than you can see theirs. That's why they're advanced fighters and we're all learning, but that's okay. So once you get a sense of that, you can kind of get a sense of where they're going to be. So again, I just practice it on the Pell. So if I'm looking at this guy, I'm like, all right, here's my aggressive Pell. I know that they take a big passing step, they would end up right there, right? They would be there. So what I do is I kind of put myself in the motion where that step has already started. So maybe I will get up a little bit closer and think, okay, if they're coming forward, what's it going to feel like for them to start to inhabit this space while I step out into this? So maybe I'm getting out a little far out of my Pell, but I'm picturing them coming in. But that helps because I know that if I get that step wrong, they're going to crash into me. So now same thing, I'm picturing them, they're most likely going to end up right here, they're going to come forward. If I do this step, you see how much tighter in the angle, if this person comes into me, they're going to run into me. So let me do it with my my back to the Pell really quickly. So again, if I'm here and I'm picturing them coming forward, if I step here and they're coming forward on that line, up on this line, if I do my pivot, great, I'm pretty clear. If, however, I do this step, I pivot, oh, I'm really close in that line, they're probably going to crash into me. So you can, like I said, it's mostly a mental thing, but it's a way to start drilling the motion that will get you clear of what you perceive your opponent is going to do. And then on the offensive side, picture them defending in different ways and see how it feels to throw the thing and then turn it into the next thing. I think, did I get that? Picturing the Pell in motion, hip, shoulders, weight, and stance. This is not a Pell work question, but somebody asked me, how much do I drill versus sparring and practice? I don't drill enough to practice. I do Pell work every day. And I also teach a class. So we do mostly drills at that class. And usually when I get to practice, we'll do a little bit of drilling, but I just want to fight. So, because that's fighter practice, particularly the local Thursday practice, even though it's mostly my squires and things, I think of it as a little bit more me time. So I tend to show up and fight, and I'll work on my stuff and I'll help them. But if my students show up early, I will drill with them. But that 7 to 9:30 window is more my time, and I should drill more, but I really like to fight, so that tends to be that time. As a culture, the SEA, we don't really drill enough, and if you look at other combat sports like boxing or Muay Thai or Jiu-Jitsu or fencing or HEMA, which is coming up, they tend to drill a lot more than we do. The benefit is that SEA fighters' soft skills, a sense of timing and range and angles, tends to be developed fairly quickly, because if you don't get cracked in the head, but often technical development lags, because if you're fighting for survival all the time, it's really hard to make yourself try new stuff if you know that the penalty for getting it wrong is a big hit upside the head or a bruised shoulder or a bruise in the ribs. That's the downside of having your training be mostly sparring, is that it's very easy to get stuck on a plateau, because trying new things is risky and the penalty is pain often, right? So drills are incredibly important. And I think in a perfect world, we probably would be doing 50-50. I am probably at fighter practice, 80% fighting, 20% drills. So that's an area where I could improve as well. I want to make sure I didn't forget anything. I think I got most of it. Mental exercises. Somebody asked about drills when we get to go back. So there are 2 drills I want to talk about that will help with those things. One is called the mental math drill, and there's a few versions, but the most basic version is you have yourself and an opponent, you're in gear, and you have them set up in whatever stance they want, and you look at them and you get to decide where their opening is going to be when they move. And you need to adjust your motion so that you're in the right place. And then you get to call it. So you say now, and that person takes whatever step or motion they want. And if you got it right, you step and throw in a place that you're going to be safe and they're going to get hit. And so the problem is a lot of SEAers, they go out and they do their thing and they do not account for what the opponent is doing. So one of my most common setups, that little thrust to low shot thing, I actually will throw, if the Pell is my opponent here, I actually will throw in front. So what I do is I will throw here on purpose. Because if this is a person and they decide they want to aggress me, they want to come forward, if I throw and then I throw here, often they will actually step forward into my shot because they're coming forward and they're collapsing in space. So if I get that kind of mental math game correct, I start a shot and they actually step into it and I get to hit them. And that makes it really hard because how do you defend an opening that hasn't happened yet? Now, high-end fighters do that because they know if I move here, this will become vulnerable. But a lot of fighters, that's really, really challenging. And so you can throw at openings that will become available, and then you get to hit people and it makes fighting very simple. And that's a mental math drill. The flip side of that is actually the blind man drill. And I love this drill. My students love and hate this drill. So the blind man drill is great. Do it at least in helmets. What you do is you pair up with whatever your tools are. And if I'm the aggressor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a shot, actually, and my squire, for example, he will watch it coming in. He will block it however he wants, and I will keep positive pressure on his weapon. Then he has to close his eyes. His eyes are shut. When he feels the pressure leave on his sword or shield, whatever he blocked with, he has to defend the part of his body that he thinks is in danger with his eyes shut. Right? So he gets to learn, okay, if I block like this, the most obvious opening is probably over here. So even with my eyes shut, I need to block the most obvious opening. Did I get it right? Okay, cool. I'm gonna keep my eyes shut. When that positive pressure leaves, where's the most obvious opening? Okay, I should probably cover up here. Okay, if that worked, maybe now that leg is the most obvious opening. So you start to get a feel for where the openings will be on you. It's a very mentally tiring drill. We usually go to 3 touches and then switch, do a couple of rounds of that, because you get fried pretty quick because you're thinking and feeling really hard. And it's a very vulnerable feeling. Like, cool, I blocked the first shot. Now my eyes are shut and he's gonna swing a stick at me. And again, it's slow. If we hit each other, it's that fast because the point is feeling it. So when that positive pressure leaves, go, okay, if I did this defense, I'm probably open over here. If I did this defense, I might have to worry about that leg. And so you just get a sense of where you're gonna be vulnerable so you're not relying on looking at the sword, processing what they're doing, and then blocking the thing that's coming in. You start to learn on yourself where you're vulnerable. So I would say when we all get back together and do paired practice and fighter practice, if the things I'm talking about on the Pell sound tough, and they are, and you want to do some paired versions that might help with that or a little bit easier for people to visualize, then those 2 paired drills would be a good way to do some of the things that I'm talking about on the Pell. All right, I think I probably talked a little bit too fast and rushed, but I think that's all that I prepared. And I think I answered most of the questions that people sent in ahead of time. Let me check my messenger really quick and see what, I have many things. Okay. Let me go to, somebody, okay, somebody just asked me to repeat the paired drills. Okay. All right, so the first drill is the mental math drill. The most obvious version is you have your 2 opponents. One person is essentially the attacker. One person is essentially the counter attacker, right? And so the attacker will get in whatever stance they want, whatever weapon system they want, doesn't really matter. And they're gonna be there and they're gonna have an idea of like, okay, I'm gonna go do this thing. Maybe I will step and throw a snap, or I will, step behind a guard, but I'm gonna make a singular physical motion. The defender, the counter attacker, they're gonna look at this person, they're gonna try to get an idea of what their motion is gonna look like, and they're gonna try to figure out how they're going to move and attack so that they are staying safe at hitting that person in the moment that they move. And when they feel like they have that correct, they're gonna say, now. And when that person moves, they're gonna do their motion. And if they guessed right, then they're gonna keep themselves safe and hit the opening that is created in the attacker's motion. If they don't get it right, you reset and you try it again. This is really meant to be a slow motion drill, like half speed. This is not supposed to be a club each other kind of a drill, because then nobody wants to do anything because it hurts. So again, it really is about this speed. So if I'm the attacker, I'm gonna get in my guard. I'm gonna okay, I know what I'm gonna do. When you, the defender, says now, I'm gonna step forward. I'm gonna do my thing, and then I'm gonna freeze. And if you, the defender, got it right, you will have moved and hit me. Great, and then we can switch roles. The blind man drill is essentially that from the other side. So I'm going to take my tools, and if my Squire Fred is swinging at me, he's going to throw a shot at me. I get to watch it coming in. I'm going to defend it however I want. Once I've made that block, though, he's going to keep a little bit of positive pressure on my tools, and I'm going to close my eyes. When I feel him leave, when I feel that positive pressure come off of my tools, I'm going to defend what I think is the next most vulnerable position. So my eyes are shut. I'm going to defend. And if the block comes in, I keep my eyes shut. He's going to keep a little positive pressure. And then when his pressure leaves, I'm going to block the next thing that I think is the most likely thing. The reason this holds up its speed is that every attack has an easiest second shot. Duke calls it the first fastest. What is the first fastest thing that I can throw? So if I've thrown on my Pell here, if I've thrown my snap, and this person has done, let's say, this kind of standard hanging block, right? If I throw my snap and this person from the standard hanging block, very likely the easiest thing for me to hit is going to be a low offset, most common. And that's a very easy turn. I just kind of turn my hand up and hit. So as soon as they feel me leave, they're going to feel where they're vulnerable and hit. And I could go to other things, but that takes more time. So let's say rather than do this, I want to throw a double snap, right? There's a reason that's a great combo. But if I want to throw a double snap, it takes a little bit more of a load. My opponent gets more cues about what I'm doing, where like a high-low, that takes no time with pretty much no loading motion. So if you're going to pick a thing to defend, you should pick the first fastest thing your opponent can throw, because if they go to a secondary attack, you get more time and more of a visual tell to go to the next one. But if somebody throws at me and I do this, and as soon as they leave, I come over here, they have to go to something else, and that takes more time. And so I generally, the way I like to, well, there's a hierarchy of defense. In Mark's hierarchy of not getting hit, it goes, hit them first, don't be there, block. That's a hierarchy of defense. So kill them, they can't kill you if they're already dead. Don't be there, they can't kill you if they can't reach you, and then block. And what I do is I break the body, and this is not a me thing, this has been going on since the 14th century, but I follow the quadrant rule. So I don't look at shots and go, that's a snap, that's a wrap, that's a overhand. I go, what quadrant of me is in danger? So if they're throwing over here, I block my upper left quadrant. If they're throwing over here, I block my lower right quadrant. That simplifies what I have to process, because whether doesn't really matter if they're trying to hit me here or here or here. If I defend that quadrant, then I'm pretty good. And you can make little adjustments, of course, but that's really important. And so I also, I think you can tell from the way I've been describing Pell work, and I have a very movement-heavy style because I prefer weapon forms that don't have a large passive defense, and I came from movement-heavy combat sports before I came to the SCA, boxing, fencing, taekwondo, stuff like that. I've always preferred to be an outside fighter. So I do a lot of coming in, doing my thing, and leaving, and denying my opponent the chance to have long drawn out engagements where we're both planted, both because that doesn't tend to favor the weapons forms that I like, and because I think it's poor fighting from the schools that I came from. So if the person's throwing, if we're at a reasonable range, if we're here, if I throw a flat snap and I hit him, and I'm still at this range, even if I throw that wrap, the amount of difference that I'm getting is not humongous. So if I'm at this range and I defend, I essentially get to block the same thing the same way all the time. The closer, though, I get to the person, the more now if somebody throws a wrap, I have to worry about blocking the back of my head. Well, that just sucks. So I prefer to maintain kind of an intermediate to long range fight, whether I'm fighting sword and buckler or I'm fighting the longsword. It keeps me safe. until I do my thing, and then I lead back out to that safe range, which is why the footwork is so important. There's an online class somewhere that I taught. It's essentially called the defensive wedge, and it just says that if I'm at a long range with my opponent, whatever they throw at me, little tiny turns cover me regardless. But the closer I get to them, the wider that wedge of real estate I have to defend gets. So if I have my sword and buckler, my little tiny no passive defense thing, and somebody's pretty far away from me, this defense will cover pretty well. But if I get close to them and I have to start worrying about these big crazy wraps or these big crazy offsides, now this kind of becomes a giant pain in the butt, and it's not nearly as much fun. So I prefer that kind of outside fight. Cool. Any other questions for you?
We do have a few questions, but they were asking for it to be at the very end of everything that we're talking about.
Probably the very end. It's 5:22 for us, so yeah, please.
Well, I do have one question that is unrelated to
Okay.
the very end question. Just because I'm curious, do you have any rituals that you tend to do in preparation right before fighting? Do you like leave dirty socks on for a week before or anything strange?
No, so when I'm fighting in tournaments, so there's kind of a mental process. So when I fight in a tournament, I'm looking to test my art. And so the art is much mental. So when I fight in a tournament, every fight is the only fight that exists in all the world. There has never been a fight before or a fight ever after. This is the only fight that exists ever in the universe. And then when it's over, it's gone. And the next fight is the only fight that exists in the entire universe. I want to be completely present and mindful in that fight. And for me, a perfect fight is when I get in front of my opponent and you can kind of feel that tension rising. And then I exhale and the fight's over. And there's really not a me or my opponent or even a fight. There's just the moment kind of unfolds and then somebody's dead. You can, I call it stepping into the river of flow. And you can read books about flow state in other things that talk about it in music and in other sports. But also I've been practicing Zen Buddhist for about 20 years. So that kind of no mind language really works for me. In terms of rituals, the one that I have is when I go fight in a tournament and I salute my wife. I tend to usually have too much nervous energy. I think you can tell I get excited. So when I salute my wife, I always salute her and I take a very deep breath and I make eye contact with her. And then I picture releasing that excess energy into the ground. So I just kind of take a deep breath, hold it for a slow count, and let that excess energy out. And then I go and I salute my opponent, and then there is just the moment happening, and then it's over. And that's how I approach tournament fights.
That's really great advice. We also have another question. Do you ever fight at the Pell from your knees?
Do you ever fight at the, no. I don't get legged super often, and I don't like knee fighting. It's one of the things in SEA combat that annoys me. So no, I don't. It's a good idea if it's something you struggle with. But for me, and I don't know if this would change in my kingdom, I can move on my knees. So I still do quite a bit of adjustment and stand switching even when I'm legged. I think there are some kingdoms that don't allow that, and I don't have a lot of advice to give for that because it's not a situation I've ever had to live through. It's a good idea though.
All right, I think then we are ready for the final question, if you're ready.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, the question is, how do you set up your schedule for Pell work? Is it Monday through Sunday? Monday you do X shots, Tuesday Y shot? Do you have multiple weapons? How do you set up a schedule for multiple weapons?
So I do Pell work every day. I generally do Pell work after dinner, and I have a rotating schedule. So let me see. I think on my phone I still have my January schedule just because I printed the other ones out. So in January, let me find my January schedule. Pell work. Monday was the longsword 1 through 6, sword and buckler 1 through 6. Tuesday was the longsword combos. I have about 15 kind of standard setups that I like, and then sword and buckler standard combos. Wednesday is the Meyer Square and the ladder drill for longsword and sword and buckler. Thursday was moving through Lignitzer 6 plays with sword and buckler. Friday was longsword, Meyer Square, some variations that I've covered in different videos. Saturday is the 1 through 6 and footwork drills. And Sunday is whatever I feel like. So it might be me doing a bunch of footwork drills, but I try to rotate it a little bit every day. Because Pell work for me is so much about embedding muscle memory and patterns and working through particular issues. When I was coming up, because I was the only, for the most part, longsword guy in my area, I eventually did squire to a knight, but he lived in a different principality. So I got to see him once every 6 months or so. What I would do is I would go to practice and somebody would kick my ass with something. And I would go home and go, okay, what was that situation? And I would think about that kind of fraction of a second where I was doing a thing and it was getting me killed. And I would slow down that fraction of a second. And I'm like, okay, if I did this and I stepped out and did this and they were cross blocking and hitting me in the offside, what do I need to do to make that not happen? And I would come up with a hypothesis. This is what I think will solve that problem. And then I would drill just that motion, I don't know, 50, 100 times a day until that next fighter practice. And then I would go out and find that guy and I would pick a fight with them and see if the solution I came up with was the correct solution. So I would say a lot of what I did coming up was very problem solving based Pell work. You know, once I figured out how to throw shots, and the 1 through 6 drill is great because it teaches you transitions, I did a lot of very focused problem solving. Now I tend to do kind of idea things. So I'm like, okay, well, I feel like that kind of pull short thrust was working really well, but now my students are starting to take that away from me. What can I use to abuse them for that and take the motion that they're using to take my cool thing away and hit them with a new cool thing? So it's kind of now an arms race where I'm trying to stay ahead of people. And I think that kind of problem solving is really helpful. And that's where that treating the Pell like the opponent and really slowing it down. Because, for example, that thrust to leg thing was getting me killed for quite a while, or double killed. Because what I was doing is I would thrust and then hit right here, right in front of the Pell, nice flat shot. Often it would land and often I'd get cracked right on top of the head. Like, all right, that's not really workable. What do I need to do? And I tried some stuff that did not work, by the way. Actually, the first thing I think I tried was this, and that just set me right into the flat snap harder. I didn't like that at all. So I tried a few different hypotheses. They did not all work right away. But that taught me how to do things in a way that works. The other thing I do now is I will look at plays from particular masters, you know, the historical fight books, and like, okay, they say this, I think it means this, I'm gonna go do this on a Pell. Well, that felt like crap. Either I'm reading it wrong or I'm moving wrong. And so I essentially am still doing Pell work problem solving, but the way I'm approaching it is a little bit differently. So if I was gonna recommend a Pell work routine for somebody, a few things that I would say is that because it is for embedding mechanical patterns, working on things, it probably should be more mentally tiring than physically tiring. And because of that, I would do short bursts rather than try to go do a marathon. If I'm trying to focus on, and maybe that's just because I have ADD, but if I'm trying to focus on something, if I go, I'm going to go do an hour of Pell work and I'm going to refine this thing. After about half an hour, I start to get a little fuzzy brain, my focus is slipping, and I don't want to risk grooving the wrong pattern. So I would rather see somebody do 15 minutes every day or half an hour every day and do really focused, concentrated Pell work than do an hour once a week where they're just kind of mindlessly hitting the Pell. I think that focused work will provide much greater benefits. And so that's what I would recommend. So it depends where you are. If you're a newer fighter, go out and practice those mechanics and do your static Pell work until you know you have a good mechanic, the flat snap, the offside, the wraps if you throw them, the offside leg. Learn how to practice, hit those moving, and then start putting together some of those patterns. If you're more intermediate or advanced, keep doing those kind of basic drills because they're helpful. You can never do the fundamentals too much. That's a real thing. and then think about some problems that you're having. Every time this happens, I get legged, or every time this happens, I get hit in the head. And slow down that kind of that moment, figure out what is happening that's getting me hit or causing my shot to fail. And really work through that very slowly until you're sure, like maybe this elbow needs to rise a little bit more because it's going to change the angle as I'm stepping, or maybe I need to step 3 inches more out and pivot and turn, and that will let me hit that angle and keep me safe. But you have to do that slow, and then you embed that motion slowly. So I would say do a mix of kind of the standard drills, and then maybe pick a thing to work on that you're doing some problem solving. And do 15 minutes a day is way better than an hour once a week. We all have lives and families and things that are going on, so I'm certainly not saying don't do anything if you can't do that. Pell work once a week is a hell of a lot better than no Pell work ever. And if you don't have a Pell, you can do pretty much everything we're talking about without it. I just like having a point of reference to hit. Certainly there have been times in my life where I lived in an apartment and I didn't have a Pell. You could have a piece of tape, you could have that open edge of the door, and you do it with the yardstick. You can do it in front of the mirror, and just try to be mindful of having those good mechanics and things like that. And that's kind of how I would say. The thing is I think a lot of people, if you said to them, I would like to do bag work once a week and become heavyweight boxing champion of the world, people would think that you're kind of bonkers. Or I'm going to go to jiu-jitsu class 3 times a month and I'm going to go win the world championships. And people would be like, you're crazy. But a lot of people kind of approach SCA heavy combat training that way, where they go to a couple of fighter practices a month, or they do Pell work every once in a while. And you can do fine. You can have a lot of fun. And if that's what you want to do, that's awesome. If having a bash with your friends is your motivation, great. But when you look at the really, really good fighters in the SCA, when you look at the gods and you talk to them about their training, what they'll tell you is that they trained really hard. They were going to 3 and 4 fighter practices a week. They're traveling all over the place. They're kind of obsessive. And they train often, so in our side of the world, Jade, who's won 18 crowns, is the most famous, and he talked about the thousands and thousands and thousands of hours he did on the Pell in fighter practice. Uther, who's our king right now, has won like 9 crowns or something ridiculous. And he is a crazy person. He is super obsessive. He has the best fighter brain. He and I fought one time and I did really well and I was feeling good about myself. And then we didn't get to fight for like 4 months because we lived in different parts of the kingdom. And then we met up at a fighter practice and we fought, and I did significantly less well. And I was just like, God, I was kind of sitting there feeling a little sorry for myself. And Uther comes and sits down and goes, Mark, the thing is to you, we fought 4 months ago. To me, we fought yesterday. And I'm like, whoa, that's a different level. And it changed the way I approached training, because there were people that were treating it like a martial art or a high level combat sport that were training that way. And so if your goal is to compete with some of the best SCA fighters out there, you have to train like those really, really good guys. And there are a few people that can get really far on natural talent, but I've never met one of the gods that walks that didn't combine that talent with a ton of hard work, and then they're monsters and very scary. So sorry, I went on a bit of a rant, but the training culture I think is really important, and finding a way to make that a habit is just really important.
Well, I think that is it for our questions. You've been phenomenal, and everybody is just going on and on with their thank yous and gratitude for taking the time to do this. So thank you for everybody. I'll speak on their behalf for doing this.
Well, thank you for setting this up. And I know I get a little excited and talk a little fast. And I definitely talked some conceptual and philosophical stuff. So if there were technical questions that people felt like weren't answered but would like to be, please feel free to put a comment on the fighter practice page or send me a message, and I will do my best to answer them, even if I have to film little videos and put them on YouTube. Right.
Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I look forward to seeing you on the group page.
All right, thanks so much.